Hello and welcome to another Property Solvers podcast. This is Ruban Selvanayagam. I'm here with James Durr. How you doing, James?
Hello, everybody. I'm good. Ruben, yourself?
Yeah, all good, thanks. All good. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the topic of whether buy-to-let is dead or whether buy-to-let is still worth it as an investment strategy. Let's get straight into it. I've probably got my opinions on the matter, but perhaps, James, you want to start by kind of letting the listeners know what your thoughts are and where you think. Do you think that buy-to-let is a dead investment strategy?
Yeah, I think definitely in the last couple of years, buy-to-let has certainly become a lot more difficult to make it work. I mean, there's been a combination of an increase in interest rates, obviously, that everyone who's not tied into a fixed rate mortgage will be paying more per month on their mortgages. So this combined with the Section 24 tax changes for people who own properties in their personal name is making it increasingly difficult to make buy-to-let work and to make it cash flow at any sort of decent return on equity. Like obviously, interest rates you can kind of understand, right? Because interest rates are something that are cyclical. They're something that in a sense you can plan for. And obviously, like when we're at sort of close to 0% interest rates, you know that they're not going to stay there forever. And you have to plan for sort of interest rates going up in the long term. And obviously, with inflation being high, it was obvious that interest rates were going to go up. And you need to make provisions in your cash flow for that happening. But I guess what blindsided a lot of buy-to-let investors was the Section 24 changes that were brought in 2016, I think, by George Osborne.
Yeah.
Where landlords would get taxed on revenue rather than profit. So whereas interest payments for mortgages were an allowable tax expense pre sort of 2017, I think it was, when they started increasing them. It might have been a bit later than that. Was it?
It was kind of
when did they actually start increasing?
Yeah, it was initially 75%, then it went to 50%, then to 25%.
Yeah, so they rolled it in over a few years, basically, where you can use less and less of your mortgage interest as a tax deductible expense to the point now where it's only a 20% credit. So basically, if you've got 10,000 that you're paying on interest per month on your mortgages, only £2,000 of that would be a taxable expense that you can write off against your taxes. Which means let's say your rent roll is 20,000. So before these tax changes, you were making 10,000 a month. Now you'd be getting taxed like as a higher rate taxpayer, for example, which is what rate, Ruben? 40%?
Yeah, roughly. And there's additional
roughly 40%. So you're getting taxed on revenue now. So your revenue is 20,000. You're only getting 2,000 as an allowable expense. So your net revenue that you're getting taxed on is effectively 18,000, even though you're only making 10. So you'd basically break even now, whereas before you were making 10,000 a month. And I think that's been a major issue why most landlords are saying that buy-to-let is dead. They're selling down their portfolios. They just can't make it work between the double whammy of interest rates and tax changes, which, I mean, in my opinion, these tax changes are incredibly unfair. I mean, I would have understood if they had brought them in and they had made it like retrospective. So basically, if you had bought pre sort of 2016, that these new tax changes wouldn't affect you, but they just brought it in as like a blanket change to all landlords. And it's made it very difficult to make buy-to-let work with a combination of those two factors. How do you feel about it, Ruben?
Yeah, I mean, just on the back of that, with the higher pay rates, so, most people who are buying kind of from the kind of, let's say, pre and post crisis era were kind of accustomed to paying low rates of interest. You know, even on buy-to-let mortgages, you know, you could still get rates, you know, sometimes about 2-3% annually. So if your fixed term has run out, you're probably going to be paying about like 5-6%, even maybe even more if you've kind of been chucked onto the SVR, which is standard variable rate. So, you know, all of those costs, well, effectively about 80% of those costs are not going to be deductible, you know, so your actual tax liability is a lot higher now. So yeah, it's a full reason why like a lot of people are selling. I mean, we're talking a lot about,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah. Sorry, James, calm. Yeah.
no, I was just going to say, I mean, obviously, if you're a new entrant into the market or people who came in, let's say, post 2016, when these tax changes came in, I mean, the silver bullet that most property gurus were saying was a solution to this was just to buy in a limited company. But for me, that's not the panacea either, because with a limited company, you're now getting charged 25% corporation tax. And then I think for a top rate taxpayer, I mean, you'd have to check some of these figures because I'm not 100% sure on these figures, but I think if you're a top rate taxpayer, you're paying in the region of 33% to withdraw dividends. So like your real tax rate on limited companies, if you actually want to get the cash in your hand, is like 53%, you know? And I think, yeah, it's just symptomatic of how much tax burden has increased in the UK and how it's like anti the landlord sector and housing in general at the moment.
Yeah.
And so I think even if you're coming in and you're looking at buying at a limited company, I mean, you're also paying sort of rates at the moment of like, let's say between 5.5 to 6.5%, I'd say is probably the range of where
yeah, I mean, you could probably
are.
get lower if you're willing to put down more of a deposit, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that would be based on like a 25% deposit.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, the whole buying a limited company is pretty much the norm for people that are acquiring buy-to-let properties at the moment, because it doesn't really make sense to buy in your personal name, you know, at the moment, unless, you know, you speak to an accountant and you're only planning to buy, you know, a handful of properties in your lifetime, and you can keep your tax threshold under the basic rate, you know. But even then, most accountants probably would advise you not to do it, because, you know, it just doesn't really make sense to financially, you know, and you don't really want to put yourself in that position where you're constantly working towards being below the basic rate of tax, you know. So in terms of acquiring properties, yeah, limited company is the way to go. But as James mentioned, yeah, you've got corporation tax, and I have a sneaky feeling that it's going to carry on increasing, particularly if a Labour government gets in. There's talk of it going up to like 30%, you know, to match. I think that's kind of average across Europe, I believe. So, you know, there is talk of it increasing, and I would imagine that the, you know, dividends tax and possibly even income tax is probably going to go up as well in the coming years. So yeah, you're right, James, to extract you know, your profits from your company is not going to be an easy task. I mean, maybe there's other ways you can do it, you know, investing it into SASs and SIPs and that kind of thing. But just going back to section 24, I would be, there are kind of, over the last few years, there have been a number of schemes that have appeared. They are being investigated at the moment. So I would say that anyone who does have their properties in their personal name should be a little bit cautious about these schemes that get bandied about, because they are being investigated by the HMRC. So just be a little bit careful about that. I mean, my personal opinion about buy-to-let is that it's kind of semi-dead, because I still think there's opportunities to buy properties, even if you only want single lets. You know, you could look in certain areas where you can get quite strong yields. And also, I think I mentioned it on the podcast previously, you know, you can look into other types of opportunities, you know, buying buildings. You know, we've talked about the oversupply of commercial property on the market at the moment. Perhaps you can look into those kind of buildings and see how you can, you know, maybe make them into a multi-let. HMO, I still think, is a strong sector of our industry. You know, we've never really touched on it apart from one which we did quite some years back, and we ended up turning it back into a single household and then selling it in London. But we've not really kind of touched on that area. But I do think if you can get the HMO model right and you can systemize your processes well, you know, it's a really good thing to do, you know, particularly for cash flow, and, you know, just buying these properties and holding them. Be careful about revaluations. I know there's a lot of conversation out there with regards to, you know, pulling out your money, and all that kind of stuff. But I always get worried because the valuations that come back for these HMOs is always a lot higher than what the bricks and mortar valuation is. So be a little bit careful with that. Another one that I think is worth looking into is serviced accommodation. I know there are there's been some planning changes with that. So, you know, and some tax changes as well. So before, serviced accommodation units weren't affected by Section 24, but now they are since the last budget. So there are risks there. But then I think that may help professionalize the sector a little bit as well. So those are kind of areas that I think could work. I mean, strictly speaking, it's not buy to let or vanilla buy to let, but you're still buying properties to let them out. You're just doing it in a different kind of way, you know. And I think the opportunities lie in those kind of areas, particularly kind of buying buildings, converting them, maybe even keeping part of it commercial and having the uppers as residential. You know, and those kind of areas I think are most interesting rather than the vanilla buy to let. I mean, what do you think, James?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, like, obviously there's loads of these strategies, but I think for long term, buy to let is always going to be there. Because at the end of the day, like, families always need a place to live. And all these other strategies like service accommodation, HMOs, they're getting regulated. Like, the government are just regulating the shit out of everything right now. And like, service accommodation is one where they've just rolled back on the tax. Like, you can no longer write off interest. The Section 24 applies to service accommodation now, doesn't it?
Yeah. So
whereas it was a way to
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it was a way to get around not having to sort of you could write your interest rate
I
payment
think, James,
off.
that was inevitable. They were always going to do that. And it, for me, it's just kind of a nail in the coffin that they're never going to reverse Section 24. You know, it's not going to happen, I don't think, especially when Labour.
No, but I mean, yeah, what I mean is they've reversed the fact that, like, on serviced accommodation, Section 24 didn't apply
Right. Yeah.
before.
That's right.
And now they've changed it so it does apply. So again, like, you know, you thought like a lot of buy-to-let landlords had flipped into the service accommodation strategy because they thought that, okay, at least I'll be able to still write off my interest payments because I'm using this new strategy. Now they've cracked down on that. Like, HMOs, they're always regulating, you know, like when we were doing like our sort of bit of experience in HMO, like, we faced a load of regulations. Like, obviously there's basic stuff that help the tenant, but there's always more and more regulation coming on those types of sectors. I think even in buy to let, like, we've seen like regulation come in terms of like all the tests that you have to do for, like, you know, like electrics, like having to get new ICR tests. Like, obviously there was something to do with water, wasn't there? There was like water tests that you had to do. And there's constantly more and more regulation coming in, and there's costs involved in all of these. But I think out of all the sectors that you mentioned, probably buy to let is still like the least regulated. It's kind of the easy to do.
Yeah, I
And I think long term.
Sorry, James. Yeah, just going to say, I think if you're looking at a long-term wealth building strategy, vanilla buy-to-let is good. If you've got a decent amount of capital, you want a relatively hassle-free way to put them, you know, to lock your money away. Single let, vanilla buy-to-let is probably a good thing to do because, you know, myself and James have been doing single lets for, you know, James has been doing it longer than me, but let's say 15 to 20 years. We've both been doing it. And, you know, a lot of the single let tenants, they just want to stay in the property for as long as they can. And, you know, you can gradually increase the rents as you go along, maybe inflation trap them. James, you're a lot better at doing that than I am, and build it as a kind of arm's length type of business, maybe where you've got a lettings manager in there that just kind of deals with the day to day. And you can pretty much sit back, and as long as the property's in decent condition, you can sit back and just let it do its thing, gain value over time. I mean, at the moment, capital values are not going up, and I don't think they're going to go up massively over the next few years. But I do think that if you're willing to buy at a reasonable, price, maybe if you can pick it up at auction, or you can talk to us about the properties that we're selling, you can pick up a decent property, maybe get, an 8-9% yield. Yeah, you will be paying quite high mortgage rates, but then hopefully in a few years you might be able to refinance, perhaps pull out some of your money, or make a bit more cash flow on the property, and rents would have been increasing. Because that's one thing that is happening, because well, not I wouldn't say all landlords, but a lot of landlords are selling. It's creating the supply side issue. I tested a property up in Barnsley just for the rental market, and was just inundated with applications. And these rents were like really high for the area. Well, what were previously considered really high for the area. And I had a decent waiting list of people wanting to look at the property, So I was quite surprised that, the level of demand there was for these rental properties. And I think that may end up, it's simple supply and demand economics, you restrict supply, it's going to gradually start filtering out into the market. So maybe single lets might work out for the better, because there's just not much supply at the moment, because everyone's selling. So
yeah, I think what's going to happen over time is, like, at the moment, like, we've got a period of adjustment where basically mortgage rates are high, yields haven't really, like, they've increased, but not so much at the moment, right? But rents are going up. They're going up, as you mentioned, Ruben. Prices in a lot of areas are being compressed. So what you've got is a combination of, like, rents going up, values being compressed, which means like rental yields are actually getting better.
Yeah.
And the difference between what your rental yield is and what your mortgage rate is growing, which means that obviously over time the cash flow of each property is actually improving. And obviously if house prices do drop, that's going to improve more. So what we've got at the moment is we do have a short-term issue where, like you said, Ruben, like obviously interest rates are going up, like the cash flow has been eroded by all these sort of factors that we've talked about, like the tax, the interest rate increases, like the regulation, the extra costs. And we've got a situation where right now, buy to let, it does feel like it's dead, right? It feels like unprofitable. And that's why a lot of landlords are getting out of the sector. And I've been in the sector for 20 years. I'm selling down my buy-to-let portfolio, that's owned in my own name, because it's no longer tax efficient. The cash flow isn't there. It's actually like almost negative when you take into account like all the tax changes and refurb costs and all the rest of it. So like for people like myself, and bear in mind, I'm not a landlord who's highly leveraged. Like I'd have maybe 55% loan to value across my portfolio, which is really a sort of prudent level to be leveraged at. So that's not been an issue for me, but it means like instead of like renting these properties out and earning like a minimal amount of rent per month, like I'm selling these properties, I'm releasing those chunks of equity, and then I'm using that money to get into either better deals in a more tax efficient structure. So like buying new deals in a limited company, or else looking for like returns where I can earn a better return than buy to let, whatever that is. And obviously I know you pointed out like there's a couple of things that you can do, like they can invest in ISAs and pensions and all that. And without going too far off topic, I mean, that stuff is great, but obviously remember, with a pension, if you lock money into a SIP or a SAS, that money is tied up till you're 55. And there's the opportunity cost of, what you could earn on that money if you've got it liquid now, and you can make like I know there's tax savings from putting it in pension. Obviously, you can defer tax, and for some people, it is prudent to, like, max out your SIP contributions
Right.
at a time when, like, your tax bill is high, and there's a way that you can sort of defer taxes that way. But
Mm,
you are losing the opportunity cost of actually being able to earn a return on that money sort of today.
mm,
And obviously for me, if I know that, like, I can earn better than, let's say, a 10% return on investment per year, um, then I'm better keeping that cash liquid to put into sort of other deals, flip opportunities, trades. And then when the time is right, when those interest rates drop, the rents have obviously increased. I mean, I don't see the rents dropping. I mean, once the price of rent goes up, they don't tend to come back down.
mm.
So you will have a situation where interest rates start coming off. Rental prices will remain high. Obviously, supply will be less than it was previously because so many landlords have left the sector.
Yeah.
Property prices, again, if we do head into recession, and a lot of the economic indicators are pointing towards a recession, then a combination of these three factors. So you've got decreasing prices, you've got decreasing interest rates, and high rents, will mean that buy to let will become attractive again, and you can get ahead of the market right now if you're buying at discount and price in price drops into your offers, buy below market value. Therefore, you can create sort of higher yields and even make those buy to let deals work now where they wouldn't at sort of open market value prices.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think as well, there's
You
always
there,
going to
Ruben?
be demand for um, buy-to-let properties. I don't think, I mean, unless you're buying, I know there's certain parts of like the northeast which are kind of no-go areas, or they're just very risky. You can buy properties for like 10K, and get like kind of 12-13% yields on them, but then you've got other issues that, the demographic profile is not as great as other parts of the country. You're dealing with kind of housing benefit tenants and that kind of thing, which, if that's your bag, that's your bag, and you've got systems to manage that. I know there are a couple of guys that do that quite well, like John Paul. There's a few social housing providers as well that do that really well, successfully. So if you get that model to work, then great. But I think there's always going to be a strong demand for rental properties. If you can get the figures to work, then it can definitely work in your favor. And I was going to mention something about the whole build to rent sector that's kind of grown over the last 10 years or so, but it's not growing at the pace that it needs to even make a dent on the impact of the kind of normal, quote unquote, normal landlords who are out there buying properties at auction or buying properties through companies like ours, and making it work. And I think generally that's what the tenant market prefers, dealing with a landlord face to face, and having that kind of relationship rather than this big kind of corporate entity. So there's definitely going to be demand for rental properties. It's just, yeah, as you say, James, getting the figures to work, and figuring out how you can buy a decent price and take into account fluctuations in the market. Buying at the moment is tough. The lenders out there are super strict. If you want to secure buy-to-let financing at the moment, any type of financing, you're jumping through 1,000,001 hoops, but it's definitely possible. And if you're buying at the right price, it's probably worth it. Yeah, it's a debate. I don't know what you think about it, but would you
Just like the
say,
rental coverage there, like,
yeah, it's kind of like about the stress test is around kind of 150%, I think, at the moment, roughly, right? But
which is a good thing, really, because a lot of
yeah,
people
you're
complain
protecting
about, like,
yourself.
oh, this doesn't stack because of stress tests or
Yeah,
whatever. But at the end of the day, I mean, it actually helps protect you. And,
yeah,
like, the reason banks do it is because it makes it safer to lend. And yeah, stress tests for me, they're a good thing, So it's not something that we should really be complaining about. And maybe if, like, your property doesn't stack due to the stress test, then maybe it's not a good rental property, and that's it.
yeah. It's fair point to
And
make.
we've had a couple of those, Ruben.
Yeah.
We've had a couple of those, right, where we looked at the stress test and we're like, okay, like, I mean, we had planned maybe like to rent like a flat. I remember in London, a flat that we had, and we were planning to rent it. But once you looked at the stress test and the amount of actual money that you have to tie into it as a result of the stress test, it just meant that buy to let for that particular flat wasn't the right strategy, and we ended up flipping that one on. So I think you got to look at each of these properties, look at what the rental cover is, and see if it really stacks at current interest rates, because definitely a lot less properties than before are stacking up.
Oh yeah,
So you need to be a lot more choosy about which sort of deals that you're buying and what you're renting out.
Yeah, especially in London and the southeast, you know, it's going to be really difficult to do unless you're willing to put down a hefty deposit. And if that's your objective, then fine. You know, maybe you've got money stored away and you just want to put it in property and just kind of have a reasonably hassle-free buy-to-let portfolio that's going to grow in value over time. You know, it's not a bad investment strategy. You know, it just really depends on how you want to churn your money and how you want to earn interest on it. But buy-to-let, single lets, as we mentioned, is I wouldn't say it's completely hassle-free, because you're going to be dealing with bits and pieces, you know, move-ins and all that kind of stuff, and you know, repairs and hassle tenants and all that kind of stuff. But that's just something that myself and James are used to at this stage, you know. So yeah, James, do you have any oh yeah, actually, James, one thing I was going to ask you, not to get into this whole interest rate debate again, but if you were taking out, say, for example, you had a buy-to-let property that stacked out reasonably well, would you go for a 2-year fixed or a 5-year fixed at the moment?
I would go for a 2-year fixed right now.
Right. And why is that?
Which might surprise you a bit, Ruben, because I'm always saying, like, let's just take the long-term
I think it's
rates
I think the main thing that we discuss
like if it stacks,
is the fee, isn't it? The arrangement fees at the moment.
That's the one caveat. Like, I'd want to see what the arrangement fees are, because I think what people are falling into right now is banks are absolutely coining it right now on these arrangement fees. And like, people are not thinking, like, if you're going to basically like jump around interest rate deals, like, they're not actually calculating how much those arrangement fees add to the total loan amount over 25 years.
Yeah.
And if you're like jumping rate every 2 years, it can add a shitload, like, to what you owe.
Yeah.
And I think you really need to be careful on arrangement fees. But if you're talking to me about, like, do I think rates will be lower in 2 years, then I would say yes, rather than 5 years. But obviously you got to take a view on how much it's actually going to cost you in terms of like switching all these products and what rates you're going to get.
And the hassle
but
as well.
I mean, even the markets. Yeah, I mean, even the markets right now, they're pricing 2-year bonds like at higher interest rates than the 10-year.
Right.
Which, like, there's an inverted yield curve, right, which is another leading indicator of a recession.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so yeah, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. As always, I always do. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, and we look forward to doing this again next week. Please remember to like and subscribe.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you. Bye.
Any questions, send them to Ruben.